Hi everyone, welcome back, and today more philosophy and not really too much of the spiritual side. I think we'll see where it goes. And I mentioned the problem of induction a couple of weeks ago, and David Hume, and I thought I'd just go into that in a bit more detail because it is an interesting subject, and yeah, I'm in that mode, so why not? And I do have my own opinions on this, so I think they're worth sharing, so we'll see what you think. So what I'd like to start with is just really to outline what the problem of induction is in a bit more detail. Now, basically, there's two ways for us to reason. There's deduction and induction, and we don't know of any other ways to reason than these two ways. And deduction is things like mathematics and logic, such as 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's a deduction. And the reason it's a deduction is that the word for, or the symbol for, means exactly the same as the word 2 plus 2. And that's what the equal sign means in that formula. So really you're just saying 4 is the same as 4, but in different words. And all deductions are like that. That on one side of the formula we say this and this and this is the same as this and this and this. It can be in the form of words as well. So the meaning of a word, in a way, what we're doing the same thing, aren't we? We're saying this is the word and it's the same as this meaning, and this meaning is the same as this word. So it's a kind of deduction. The answer is contained in the question for a deduction. And logic is also like this. Most of us haven't really been exposed to formal logic. It's something we do cover in philosophy, and maybe I'll go into a little bit of it at some point. But if you look at algebra, which most of us have done at school, it's a similar thing. You can deduce what would be on one side of that equal sign, or that therefore sign. You can deduce from what's on this side. So even though you've got an x on one side, you can deduce what that x will be from what's on the left hand side. And in a way, that x is contained in that question, in that algebraic question. Sometimes it's not easy to work it out, and you have to swap all the numbers around and turn minuses into pluses and divides into timeses and swap loads of brackets around and things like that. But eventually you'll find that that x that's on the right was somewhere in that question. Yeah, it's there. And you can have x's on both sides sometimes, and you can find all of them. Yeah, and sometimes you look at an algebraic question and you're like, well, how can we ever find out what this x is? x1, x2, x3, xyz. How can we find that from that? But you can. And that's the way logic is as well. And that's the way all deduction is. And sometimes it's not obvious that the answer is in the question, or the question is in the answer, but it is. So that's deduction. Now induction is, in some ways, it's a bit more useful, because in fact the answer isn't in the question, and the question isn't in the answer. And induction is where we look, it's also something that applies to the world. See, what deduction applies to is concepts, like language, like mathematics, symbols, algebra, so on. But induction applies to the real world. And induction is where we look at the past and predict the future. So, in the past, I've been able to get this camera to work. I'm expecting it to work again exactly the same way. Now, the problem with induction is that how can we prove that we are right to look at the past and from that predict the future? Or as Peter Lipton put it, and I think this is even broader and I think it opens it up brilliantly, how can we look at what's been observed and from that be confident about what has not been observed? Yeah, that's what we're doing. That's how uncertain really it is. And in actual fact, if you look at the mathematics of induction, you can come up with a formula, and this is a deductive formula, yeah? You can come up with a formula that shows all the past instances are as observed and the future instances are different. And that formula is no more deductive or no more rational than the formula that shows all past instances continuing in the same way. And in fact, you can have a million such formulas, or an infinite number, presumably, of such formulas that all show the past as we know it's been, and show the future as being different. So, deduction doesn't actually help us establish induction as a reasonable or rational practice, as far as we can tell so far. So there's been various attempts to answer this problem, and I always like to put problem in quotation marks, and in a future video I'll be talking about quotation marks. They're very important in philosophy, and I found them to be a very useful tool, and so I think it's worth sharing. But anyway, that's for a future one. But this so-called problem of induction, it's called Problem of Induction, and it's a bit funny in a way, because isn't deduction in the same position? What can we use to prove deduction is reasonable and our use of deduction is right? Well, we can't use induction because it doesn't apply. Induction applies to the real world, it doesn't apply to concepts. So we can't use induction, and of course we can't use deduction, because if we use deduction to try and prove that deduction is correct, then we're begging the question. We're assuming it's correct because we're using it to try and prove something, and that something that we're trying to prove is whether deduction is correct or not. So we could be using a tool that isn't proven to be correct to try and prove something, and the thing we're trying to prove is that very tool, so we're in a big circle. So we can't use induction, we can't use deduction, and this is the same with induction. You know, it's the same argument. We can't use deduction because it doesn't apply. We can't use induction because that would be begging the question and it would be circular. So unless we can either find another form of reason, which doesn't seem very likely, people have been looking for that for thousands of years, it seems like we're in a bit of a pickle. And I mean, induction is at the heart of science, and it's at the heart of everything we do. The reason I would leave this room via the door rather than through the window is because I expect by leaving the door I won't injure myself. Yeah. As I jump out the window, I'm on the 3rd floor here, I would get injured or die. So that's induction. But we don't. What they're saying is we don't really have a reason. We don't have a justification for assuming that. And Hume's answer to this problem was basically to say we don't have a choice. We're psychologically programmed, and it's inevitable that we will act from induction. And that's true. And there have been other attempts to answer this sceptical point about induction. And I'm going to go into one of my attempts. And I've talked about before in the logical space video, I've talked a little bit about Peter Lipton's pragmatic or parasitic argument. That basically, if anything will work, induction will work, and even if something else does work, like reading tea leaves or flipping coins or whatever, the only way we'll know it's working is because we'll look at the past and say, look, it's working. It worked in the past, so we'll be back into induction again. So in a way, induction's always going to play a part, so we might as well use it. Now there are some answers to all this, and there are some questions about this, and I think the general consensus in philosophy is that there hasn't been a justification for induction. But I would like to say that actually the problem is deeper than people realise, and it's actually the problem of reason, not of induction. And what we're talking about here is the limits of reason itself. And this is what we're coming up against, and I think a lot of philosophers don't realise or don't want to accept that there are limits to reason and logic and these kind of ways of thinking. And the problem of induction, which I would like to call the problem of reason, is showing us this. So I wrote a little dialogue, and it's a bit cheeky because I've written it in the form and in the sort of the language that Hume uses himself in some of his dialogues. And as I've said before, he's very readable. So in the logical space video, I mentioned a couple of his books that are quite short and readable and interesting. And one of them's written in a dialogue form, and he has two main characters in there. Philo, sort of short for philosopher, who is generally thought to represent Hume himself, and Demea, D-E-M-E-A, who in one of the dialogues on, I think it's on the one on natural religion, he represents the sort of traditional Christian believer. But in my dialogue, Demea represents the traditional Humean believer in the problem of induction. And I suppose Philo represents me, or the philosopher, in a dialogue. So I've called this Inquiries on Natural Induction, or the Problem of Reason. And so it just starts with Demea, as though he's finishing something that he was saying. So this is why induction cannot be trusted. What say you, Philo? And Philo replies, Demea, let me summarise your argument and tell me if I'm right. Demea, please do. Philo, we have only two ways to reason, either deduction or induction. That is to say, we can either use pure logic, or we can observe cause and effect and induce future effects from those. Demea, exactly so. Philo, pure logic or deduction can have nothing to say on the matter of cause and effect, as this can only be gained from observation and experience. So only induction applies to the realm of real events. Demea, that is correct. Philo, your question is, how can we prove induction itself? We cannot use deduction, as it does not have application, and we could never accept an inductive argument because it would beg the question. Demea, you see the problem. Philo, as we have but two ways to prove such questions, and they are both ruled out, as it would seem, logical space again here, we cannot prove induction's credentials and must distrust her. Demea, indeed. Philo, further, this is a quandary, as we have no choice but to act through the use of reason and say, leave buildings via a door rather than up a story window, fully believing this to have better outcomes, yet with apparently no rational justification. Demea, that is the problem. The problem of induction it is called. There is no answer possible, Philo, admit it. Philo, you call it the problem of induction. Could it not equally be called the problem of reasoning? Demea, how do you mean? Could I not launch the same attack against deduction? How can we trust deduction? It cannot prove itself, because that would beg the question, and induction does not imply. Therefore, both branches of reason are broken off at the trunk and cannot support each other. Demea, I do not seek to attack induction, just merely point out the case already existing against it. However, deduction is normally thought to be self-evidently correct. We know it instinctively. It has much proved by the obvious correctness of its conclusions as it is by its contradictions, which are equally plain. Philo, I admit that the immediate impressions to the mind of deductive arguments are powerful, yet it seems they fail in being rationally proven in the same way and on the same anvil as those of induction. Equally, our reliance on them is very similar. We are forced by our own psychology to accept that 2 + 2 = 4, just as we are that day will follow night. Demea, perhaps yes, but does my argument then not just drag down both deduction and induction together? You have not saved induction, Philo, you have just given her a companion. Philo, then it should probably be called the problem of reason rather than induction. Demea, perhaps. Philo, so can reasoning be saved from bringing itself down? Surely we are using reasoning to attack herself and then claiming that in victory she has shown her failure. Can there be a more circular argument conceived? Demea, it does sound a bit self-referential when you put it like that. Philo, and it's perhaps not surprising, when reason is both the prosecution and defence, that she should both win and lose. And who is the judge? Reason again presides and condemns herself. In such circumstances, can reason expect to get a fair trial, whether found guilty or innocent? Demea, so who should judge the trial, Philo, if not reason? Philo, I'm not sure a trial is really required. Demea, how do you mean? Philo, putting aside the problems of circularity, I would dispute that there is even evidence of a crime. Demea, has not reason condemned herself? Philo, I'm not so sure. What has really been proven against her? Isn't it just innuendo and implication? Demea, how do you mean? Philo, we cannot find proof that she is reliable, so we say she is not. This is hardly an assumption of innocence that any Crown Court would presume. Demea, but there is surely some doubt. Philo, there may be in some, but is it justified by what I shall unjustly call the evidence? Demea, we cannot verify our use of induction using reason. Is that not enough? Philo, perhaps not. What positive evidence do we have against her? Demea, we cannot find reasons to trust. Philo, that seems more against us then. But do you see my contention here? All these problems with induction are not problems at all. They're more like potential problems. Maybe it should be called the potential problem of induction. Demea, Philo, all we have shown is we have no positive reasoning to trust induction, but we have shown no positive reason to distrust her either. Demea, Philo, so why even have a trial, and more so, why condemn her? Demea, or ask her to condemn herself. Philo, indeed, it seems to have reacted like a jealous lover. Fully trusting in induction, we have suddenly come to fright. What reason do we have? None. And we have entered into distrust and suspicion as a reaction. It is as though she has done us an injury, though it was only in our minds. Demea, Philo, we search and search for certainty that our trust has not been misplaced, and finding none, we bolt. Demea, Philo, all the while accusing her of something we know not what. Demea, unjust indeed. Philo, so Demea, have I rescued induction? Demea, you have not. Philo, did she need rescuing? Demea, maybe she did not. So that's my answer to the problem of induction. Maybe there isn't really a problem. It just seems to be, because we're so used to induction, and then it's brought into question by Hume, and suddenly we come into doubt just simply because of the question, without any reason to doubt induction, or indeed deduction. So where is this problem of induction? Is it not just in our own doubt itself? So everyone's looking for some way to resolve this doubt, when it's just a doubt. That's all it is. It's kind of fear, really. So you're looking for reasons to deal with fear. Fear is just an emotion, probably, in this case. It's an emotional reaction to the familiarity of induction being snapped away from us, and suddenly we're, oh God, maybe it's not real. So there we go. That's the problem of induction, and potentially an answer to it, or part of the answer. So I hope you enjoyed that, and hope to see you again. Bye for now.